So welcome everybody to the final WEFI seminar of the term. We will hopefully restart, well, we will restart, I'll commit to that, in the fall, stay tuned. We're happy to have, as our last presentation, John Barrios presenting some work on, lo and behold, entrepreneurship. I'll let him introduce his co-authors. A reminder of the format, we'll do 40 minutes. If you have questions, feel free to use the chat. We've got a co-author here. John will pause every 10 to 15 to just see if there are any big questions. If there are deep, non-clarifying questions, we'll take that to the end after the discussion. That will be done for 15 minutes. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to John.
Thanks, Mike. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this new work that I have, Rugged Entrepreneurs, with my co-authors, Yael Hochberg from Rice and Daniele Macciocchi, who's online from Miami. And like you said, kind of this new paper deals with entrepreneurial activity. I don't have to motivate, hopefully, that much. Why do we care about entrepreneurial activity in this setting? But again, key to kind of notion of entrepreneurial activity leading to economic growth, thinking about new business formation, on how kind of, is this like one of the primary drivers? Cross-sectional variation in entrepreneurial activity with cross-sectional variation in like employment, per capita incomes. Moreover, we also think of entrepreneurs as being important for urban growth now more recently. So it's no longer about just like macroeconomic activity. It's about like local and urban economic activity. How do we spur economic activity in cities that might not have been, are more lackluster than others? There's been more attention to innovation-driven growth in particular recently, yet despite kind of all the literature, which we're not going to claim that we're new doing something completely new, but there has been kind of a fundamental, I don't know how to pronounce it or what the word is escaping me right now, but thinking about like a plethora of research on these determinants of entrepreneurial activity, yet kind of there's a lot of the variation that we still don't know about. So there's still factors that are determining this geographic distribution of entrepreneurial activity that our knowledge is limited on. And kind of to tease that out a bit, I'm going to kind of go to kind of an empirical fact that we use with our data, and just thinking about what is the geographic distribution of new business formation in the US, right? And something that kind of tickled the curiosity of me and my co-authors and I is that if you kind of look at this data set, which I'll talk about new business registrations in the US. And if you look at a panel from 1988 to present, a lot of the variation in the formation of these registrations in these new businesses seem to be explained by time invariant county characteristics. So for example, a simple kind of panel regression where we put county fixed effects explains approximately 75% of the geographic variation in new business formation, right? And this kind of suggests, when we first kind of looked at this, that there must be some time invariant factors that are potentially driving the prevalence of entrepreneurial entry in a local area, right? And think of something in the water and something historical, something that's time invariant. And that kind of led us to kind of think about, well, what is something that hasn't been looked at that's kind of more invariant? And that kind of led us to kind of thinking about culture, right? And we know from a literature in sociology and cultural anthropology that cultural factors have been known to influence entrepreneurship, right? Going back to Weber and kind of the role of the Protestant work ethic in encouraging entrepreneurial vocations in Protestant cultures very relative to kind of Catholic when we think about it. Moreover, we can just think in general, cultural factors have been, especially in the recent literature, when I mean recent in the past 10, 15 years, kind of the notion of culture and institutions and how those are also important drivers of economic activities, right? Citing the Discussants here as well in a more recent paper that we kind of hopefully build upon, Alessina and Giuliano on the role of immigrants, and then kind of what I view as seminal, given that I work with him, the Gizzo, Sapienza, and Zingales papers on the role of culture in facilitating or hindering economic activity. What's important here is we can think of culture as being sticky and persistent, right? And even though it might kind of converge, it converges at a very slow speed, right? And not as all at once, right? And that again is something that we're hoping to kind of pick up when we start thinking about what explains this variation in new business formation, right? we think that individuals have less control over their culture than other social capital, right? This kind of goes back to Becker, where you can think of, hey, as an individual, I can't alter my ethnicity, my race, my family history, right? It's hard for me to change my country or my religion. And as a result of this kind of difficulty in changing, we kind of see that kind of culture persist, right? Moreover, we have some evidence on kind of the tribal culture affecting business dealings and development entrepreneurial setting, right? And that's the kind of the Ear and Shore stuff back in 2010. So with this in mind, we kind of focus in on the specific question is, can geospatial variation in current day new business formation be explained by kind of the geographic and historical cultural factors, these artifacts that lead to kind of self-reliance or individualistic culture? So we're going to focus more on individualism in the cultural setting. You know, in the common press, we kind of have this notion that entrepreneurship is often associated with individualism, right? The desire to be one's own boss, flexibility in the workplace. That's kind of what we see when we think about starting your own business in the advertising, in the marketing. Moreover, we have evidence, you know, if you survey small business owners, like more than 50% of them report that it's the non-pecuniary benefits that were the primary reasons for starting the business. We're going to focus on individualism and this notion of kind of rugged individualism, kind of, you know, popularized back in Herbert Hoover in the 1928 presidential campaign, but it's been around. This notion of rugged individualism, especially in the American setting, has been around for much longer. But we kind of want to kind of harness this notion of individualistic society stressing personal achievement and individual values that's kind of connotated with like entrepreneurial spirit, right? And I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a slide or two. In the finance literature, you know, we have kind of this notion of individualism in the financial markets, right? This notion that individuals who are more individualistic might lead to kind of overconfidence, over-optimism, lower risk, i.e. lower uncertainty aversion. We have evidence of that kind of with individuals and trading behavior across countries. In the corporate setting, we have it in the setting of like CEOs and investments and acquisitions. And while these kind of studies tend to be kind of, you know, cross-country or like using international data, you know, it's more extensively observed by individuals headquartered or investors in kind of Christian countries that are more individualistic, right? And that's kind of where we can kind of think of jumping in here, where we're looking in the US setting and thinking about individualism and measures of individualism at the county sector. In terms of entrepreneurs, there have been research that have kind of in a more, either in a macro sense of cross country and from a more sociological perspective of correlating cultural attributes of individualism per se and entrepreneurial activity or risk taking, right? And theoretically, this is kind of consistent under a Knightian view of small business entrepreneurship, where, you know, entrepreneurs are bearing risk, uncertainty, and you can think of individualism as basically kind of watering down that constraint as individualism fosters this kind of a personal achievement, individual values, lower risk version, allowing individuals to kind of enter to these uncertain environments, i.e. entrepreneurship. Specifically, the three factors that we want to kind of think about in our paper are going to be this notion of kind of the frontier experience, this frontier individualism, the notion of the immigrant mix in terms of the diversity of the population, the historical population in the area, and we're going to kind of think about the geographic terrain as well as shaping both business entry, but also shaping the culture. And I'll kind of get into each in more detail in the following slides. So when we think of individualism, we think of like the importance of frontier experience, this presence of a continually advancing kind of frontier, living on the edge of free land, kind of is viewed as profoundly shaping the American culture, right? And this kind of frontier experience has been documented to cultivated this kind of individualism, this antipathy to government intervention, right? These populations that lived in this American frontier were not only distinctively different demographically, but were more individualistic, right? These frontier settlers were disproportionately male, prime age, foreign born. This kind of gave this essence of this frontier experience, you know, and our discussant and his kind of great paper that kind of motivated a lot of the exploration into this kind of formalizes this notion of frontier experiences and operationalizes it, providing evidence on how it's contributed to kind of individualistic culture in the present time, right? Using, for example, names, you can even see that these individualistic names in these counties that experience this frontier experience persists until today, right? So even in the present day, we see that these areas that had kind of frontier exposure are more individualistic. They tend to be more anti-regulatory, right? And it's not just a function of population density, that they do a really good job of kind of teasing that out, that it's kind of coming from this frontier experience. Operationally, Bazzi et al. Defined the frontier line as the boundary at which the population density falls below 2 people per square mile, right? So then the frontier is, we can think of these counties with low population density in close proximity to the frontier line. They incorporate time varying measure which is kind of consistent with this Turner 1896, which is like experience on the frontier, in the sense of like, how long did the county stay in these kind of conditions? And as a result, we have now a county measure that tells us the time spent in this frontier experience between 1790 and 1890, right? And they go on to show that these counties that have longer exposure to frontier conditions exhibit greater individualism, opposition to redistribution, and regulation even today. So again, we have this notion of a persistent effect of culture in the area that we can then try to see how does that relate to kind of the business formation in these areas. When we think about immigration, we have another literature of immigrants having kind of long run effects on the communities in which they settle, right? Going Giuliano and Tabellini about like how the views of immigrants kind of shape the local context and where they immigrate to. We're going to use the 1850-1920 period as this age of mass migration in the US history to kind of pick up on the diversities of these arrivals, right? These immigrants in this period were different than previous immigrant waves that came from Western Europe. Here we have more heterogeneity in the immigrants. These large numbers came from the Southern, Northern, and Eastern Europe as well. And here we kind of have this conflicting view of how immigrants could kind of shape, or diversity of immigrants could shape, new business formation. We can have a cost side if we think of the kind of ethnic fragmentation. This kind of has this negative effect on social participation, a negative effect on investment in public goods, and that might lead to kind of deterring new business formation, given the lower economic activity in these areas potentially. However, if we think of kind of this diversity angle where ethnic fragmentation is not really a negative, but allows for kind of diversifying the viewpoints in the areas, interacting with the different people, allows for new innovation to take place during this period, then we could think of this as spurring positive new business formation, i.e. growth in economic activity through new business formation. Empirically, we're going to use the diversity of the birth country. So we're going to use census data to basically pick up like a concentration of the birthplace of residents in the county in this time period. And then we're going to basically look to see how that relates with new business formation in the present day. And finally, from a geographic angle, again, this might seem a little kind of like, well, where does the geography come? Well, the fact that, geographical factors have been shown to kind of affect the historical development or the economic activities of areas, right? So they shape the culture with which these areas develop as being like a first order. For example, you can think of the ruggedness of the terrain, which is kind of what we're going to use, as making it more difficult, as being a cost, right? The cultivation is difficult, erosion becomes hazardous, transportation is difficult, there's higher building costs. You could imagine that then on one hand, these areas are going to have economic handicaps. So you could imagine that these are going to be areas where it's going to be harder to set up new businesses, but they're all not just costs. The fact that you can get isolated and you get this ruggedness in the terrain also leads into protection from physical impediments, from lawlessness, raiding, right? That this might generate culture of a community kind of feel that might lead to more innovation in these areas relative to other areas as well. So again, in these two sense, we could imagine these both shaping the culture, but also having a first order impact on how individuals develop in these areas in the long run. So to preview the results before we get into the nitty gritty of the detail of the data set and the empirical specification, we're going to find that total frontier experience is positively associated with new business formation per capita. Economically, again, a 1 standard deviation increase in total frontier experience is associated with between a 3 to 5% increase in per capita new business starts. When we look at the diversity of birthplace, that again is associated with positively with new business formation. A 1 standard deviation increase in diversity of birth countries is associated with a 14% increase in new business registrations. Terrain ruggedness is again positively associated with new business formation, around 14%. Specifically, when we think of the interactive effects of these 3 things that again are not independent of each other, counties that are characterized by having greater historical diversity are high historical diversity. When you interact that with high ruggedness or high total factor frontier experience, tend to magnify the effect on new business formation in terms of the increases in new business formation. Again, this is all endogenous, right? There's no random assignment here. So one of the key things is like, how do we think about total frontier experience being positively associated with new business formation, with the fact that we have these other correlates that might also relate to both the culture in the area as well as to new business developments. So one way that we try to get around that is by using an IV strategy to try to isolate exogenous variation in total factor frontier experience that isn't going to be related to kind of potentially the demographic factors the other cultural factors at that time period. One that we're going to use again, and we're working on a couple of others, is we're going to instrument historical shocks to the settlement process driven by climate change shocks in Europe to basically use that as basically pushing the border of the frontier or pushing the exposure to TFE, right? And here, when we use this IV strategy of instrumented migration on the TFE, we still find a significant 8% relationship between instrumented total frontier experience and instrumented and new business registrations. Finally, kind of we end the paper by thinking about, well, how does historical birthplace diversity relate to kind of the entrepreneurial activity of minority communities in current times, right? So we find that kind of high minority areas experience more new business starts when they're in a county that's also characterized by high levels of historical diversity, right? And again, here is kind of thinking of this assimilation process and the timing of the integration, right? You could imagine that these counties that experience this integration, this diversity historically, are now kind of better set up to deal with minority or different groups versus counties that have basically not had that experience, right? And as a result, you could imagine when we think of immigration flows to areas that haven't had that experience, it's more of a learning curve with the fragmentation that maybe these counties had back in the historical 1850s, right? So that could be potentially where you might see the benefit in these areas of having already exposure to this diversification. So finally, why is looking at this important? Kind of back to slide number 1, we still don't fully understand what drives the patterns into entry into entrepreneurship. While studies have explored kind of the effects of non-pecuniary benefits, wealth constraints, safety nets, regulatory aspects, there's a lot of variation left in terms of explaining new business formation, both across time and space. And our findings kind of suggest that there's like a fundamental role for America's frontier culture, specifically individualism, in shaping new business formation in the US. And we don't see this as being like an end all, we see this as like spurring more research, given the new data sets that we have out there, the new kind of shocks that we can kind of implement to kind of examine the role of cultural drivers, especially in entrepreneurial activity, right? Especially from a policy perspective, we see a lot of the concentration on kind of the economic drivers of safety nets, wealth constraints, but like cultural shapes that. And I think this kind of along these lines builds up into like how culture overall affects business transactions. So, here we attempt to kind of expand the literature on culture into the sphere of entrepreneurship in kind of the spirit of Iron Shore and Landers and Sammer, where we kind of say, hey, what are these cultural effects? Moreover, you can think of also institutional effects, and how do these relate to economic activity, right? Kind of thinking about Guizzo, Sapienza, and Zingales, where they look at kind of cultural factors like trust or social capital in business transactions, as well as kind of the role of institutions and cultures shaping the way that we transact. Here, we kind of want to bring it in the sphere of entrepreneurial or new business formation. And finally, thinking about spatial variation in new business formation, which we kind of document, and these associations between these kind of time invariant cultural attributes, we kind of think of providing new insights into the discussions that we're having on clustering of economic activities in certain areas of the country, right? This notion of there might be something in the water, because this might be related also to innovation. This might be relation to adoption of other technologies. So that time invariant essence is kind of thinking there's something in this water. And that might kind of help shed light on how we kind of think about dealing with trying to bring certain cities back from the brink. We have to take into account these kind of time invariant cultural attributes as well. And I think I've gone like 22 minutes, so I'll take, if there's any kind of like questions that.
I think let's keep going, because yeah, you're about halfway done.
Okay. So after that high level, it's kind of like the introduction. Now let's just talk about the data and some of the results. All right, so our outcome of interest is new business formation, entrepreneur activity. How are we going to proxy for that? We're going to use new data from new business registrations of new for-profit business registrations from the Startup Cartography Project. Again, here we're leveraging registration records. These are public records created when somebody registers a business as a corporation or a partnership in the state. We can think of these records as reflecting the population of incorporated businesses operating in a location, right? And this is kind of a prerequisite for growth, right? That you register the business. While again, we want to state that it is possible to fund a new business without business registrations, like a sole proprietorship. The benefits of registration are substantial, right? The limited liability, tax benefits, ability to issue and trade ownership shares, right? And the fact that all corporations, partnerships, any type of limited liability company has to register with the Secretary of State or the equivalent in each state to take advantage of this means that we kind of have a nice population of new businesses in the US. And our sample is going to consist of US counties observed quarterly from 1988 to 2016, right? Roughly 3,142 counties. Our two measures that we obtain from this data set is one on the quantity of new business registrations, right? So just the total number registered in a specific county quarter scaled by the population. But we're going to have a notion of kind of a quality index, this entrepreneur quality index, which gives us a probability that a new company in that specific cohort, that time and place, will be a high growth or innovation driven, right? And here we're trying to get at the fact that there's many types of entrepreneurship, right? Here in the paper, we're primarily focused on traditional small business as opposed to kind of high tech, high growth. But with this entrepreneurial quality index, we're able to kind of see, does the culture not only affect the quantity, but also kind of the variation in the quality or the type, not quality, but the type of new business formation in the area. In terms of our historical factors, I kind of went over the TFE already. We use this in this as Bazzi et al. 2020. Again, I don't want to kind of re-summarize, but basically it's looking at the exposure of the county to being on that frontier experience. It's going to capture the two dimensions of frontier life, population sparsity, as well as isolation from urban centers. This allows for a county level measure, TFE, that we're going to utilize. In all our tests, we standardize the TFE measure to be mean 0 and standard deviation of 1, so that when we talk about interpretation of the coefficients, take that into account. Now my mouse doesn't work.
I think your video froze, John.
Am I frozen?
I can hear you, and your screen is not moving.
Yeah, my computer's not moving.
No, let's give it a sec.
Give me a my computer's frozen. I can't even stop share.
I could probably stop sharing. Do you want to?
Could you stop sharing? Yeah, because I can't even.
Yeah, sure. Let's try it. Hold on. Let's see. Do you want us to? Okay, so we will do a whiteboard. That'll be our break point, and then I'll stop sharing. Okay, you want to try again?
No, my whole computer's frozen. That's wonderful.
Oh, there we go. You're back, but
I'm back, but my computer's not back. I can't.
Well, why don't you? I gotta get. So why don't you just? I don't know how quickly your computer restarts, but we can wait here for you. You can log back in. Let's try that. Or your audio works. Does your co-author have the slides? We could just do a kind of dual. Daniele, do you have the slides? Oh. No?
Mike, can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yeah.
Yeah, I have the newest version is just on John's computer, so I don't have access to that. If you send it to me or to you, I can share them and perhaps help John with the presentation.
Okay, let's see if
I'm actually still seeing his slide. I'm not sure.
It's just not progressing, right?
Oh, right. Okay. I didn't know if you had like broken the share.
Yeah, it's weird. Like I shared it and then it my own screen and it immediately went back to his. It's like Zoom is just sending a share. I'll try again. Let me stop his share. Oh, there we go. Okay, he's gonna come back. You can all listen to me. No, we'll just wait a minute. I think we've had about 25 of these, and this is probably the worst it's been. So that's pretty good. It's bound to happen. So I'll have everyone's attention. If you have any papers for the fall, we'll probably have these start up again bi-weekly in, I'm guessing, late September, early October. We will also try to do the lecture series again. Any topics you want to see, just drop me an email. And our student fellows, our PhD students who are I'm working with bi-weekly as well, are going to run another student, what do we call it? Student Entrepreneurial Finance and Innovation Conference or workshop. So that'll be October. Oh, I should have known this. Sorry, guys. October, one of them's here. They can tell me. 1 second. Here we go. It's going to be deadline. Oh, here we go. Deadline's August 23rd. The date is October 11th. Oh, this is good news. Who's John? We can't hear you though.
Okay.
There we go.
I'm an expert after teaching the whole past semester. That's how well.
It's all you.
All right. So that was the TFE, the total frontier experience. I shouldn't have been doing my IO stuff lately. Our second measure is birthplace diversity. In order to capture a county's historical immigrant diversity, we're going to look at the diversity in the country of birthplace in 1890 of residents in a county. We can define that as 1 minus the Herfindahl index for the county of birthplace. Birth country is going to be defined as the US or a given country or country grouping, as in the Manso et al. 2019 paper. And again, here's kind of the geographic variation in this measure. Again, red means that in 1890, you had more diversity in the population. Lighter colors means there was more concentration back then in terms of residents. In terms of terrain ruggedness, we're going to use a terrain ruggedness index. Again, this is a county level average, which is computed using the 30-art grid data on terrain variability based on Noon and Pug in the Puga paper 2012. Again, here it's kind of picturing out the not only isolation, but kind of variation in the elevation in these areas. So again, redder areas mean more rugged, more drastic, and again, mountainous areas, for example, which you see here, kind of the Appalachia Trail, and then on the West Coast would be these areas where you have more of this terrain ruggedness. In terms of controls and demographics, we're going to have annual per capita income from the US Census. We're going to control for current population density, measure the ratio between the county's population and area. We're going to look at, again, these are potentially mechanisms at which culture can affect the entrepreneurial spirit. For example, kind of Republican vote share in these areas, because as the Bazzi paper shows, individualism is also related to kind of the intensity with which people view kind of anti-regulatory, anti-tax views in a current area. Property tax rates, again, our notion is kind of thinking about, well, those are potential mechanisms to explain, but we want to see are they fully explaining kind of the cultural dimension? Is it just purely coming from kind of these views that we tend to see new business formation, or is there something else about the individualism that we're capturing that also leads to new, in addition to kind of these things? But that's something to kind of tease out as well, which I thank the discussant for pointing that out. It just jumped in my brain now, sorry. So again, we're going to have, in addition to our geographic terrain, we're going to control for the county surface area, the size of the county, the distance from the equator, the distance from which these counties are from land, from rivers, coastlines, and all these are going to be calculated from the IPUMS data. Again, this is kind of coming from the Manson et al. Paper. Some descriptives, but let's kind of get into kind of the analysis for what remains. First, we're going to start off with a simple geographic distribution of new business and trying to figure out this variation. We're going to estimate panel models at the county year quarter level. We're going to model regional heterogeneity in new business registrations by examining just variations at the year level, at the state, or with county fixed effects, kind of this unconstrained by a specific a prior distribution. And what we're interested here is kind of in the F statistics, or the significance of the fixed effects. And we're going to do this for new business startups as well as in the entrepreneurial quality. In the time series, we don't see that much variation being explained by just time variation in new business startups. Again, year fixed effects, for example, only explain 8% of the variation. It's significant. When we start kind of going at the geographic and we start kind of thinking, well, what about activity within the state? That explains roughly 30% of the variation in these registrations. But when we kind of narrow and focus in at the county level, county fixed effects, in addition to the year, explain 83% of the variation in these new business registrations. Again, consistent with something time invariant really driving some of this variation and where we see new businesses start. When we look at the entrepreneurial quality index, again, that's it's more dispersed, because when we start looking at just variation over time, it's roughly around 6% of the variation in quality is explained in the time series. Geographic starts to matter, but when we think of the county, it's still only explaining 22. So the invariant stuff is explaining roughly 22% of the variation in this entrepreneurial quality index, consistent with that, you know, innovation or quality. It might be more dispersed than just kind of the formation of small businesses. When we start now to kind of examine the role of these kind of cultural and historical factors, we're going to run, again, panel models with various fixed effects at the state and year, or state by year, that we currently have in the revision, and we're gonna control for the vector of covariates, the time invariant geographic and demographic characteristics that I showed you. All the standard errors are going to be clustered by the county, and our coefficient of interest is beta 1. That's going to try to hopefully identify some local effect of TFE after accounting for factors that may correlate with both TFE and modern culture and business graphically here, we kind of absorbing all the controls. I'm just going to show you some bin scatters between log new business registrations and the TFE measure, this positive relationship between new business formation and total frontier experience. We see, again, a positive relationship as well with entrepreneurial quality. Formerly, when we do it in a regression framework, we can kind of see roughly total frontier experience. A 1 standard deviation increase is around 3 to 4% increase in new business starts. When we look at entrepreneurial quality, again, because it is a probability, and we need to think about the scale of the beta, but this positive 0.006 increase, i.e. leads to approximately a 1.25% increase in the unconditional mean of entrepreneurial quality. Main threat to causal identification is that we have these omitted variables that are going to correlate both with contemporary culture and TFE. We're going to try to employ an IV strategy, as in the Bazzi et al. Paper, using the historical shock of the settlement process to isolate these push factors by predicting immigrant flows based on kind of weather shocks that led to increases in migrant outflows from these 16 European countries. Again, we're going to note that the coefficient of interest remains stable across the specification. The increment in R square is small, suggesting, that the omitted correlated variables are unlikely to be affecting our results. But again, this is not to say that this is a causal estimate per se, but again, more kind of consistent evidence with culture actually affecting and not picking up something else in the area. We're going to show you that when we do the second stage regression with our predicted total frontier experience, we get a consistent 8%, around an 8% increase with the instrumented total frontier experience. We also see, again, a 4% increase in the EQI from the unconditional mean of 0.04 when we use the instrumented TFE. So stronger inferences on the quality index. We're going to move now to kind of the country of birthplace diversity. Here again, we find a positive relationship with the diversity of the birth population in 1890 and new business starts in the current. Here on the, and with respect to entrepreneurial quality, we don't really find much of a relationship. It's kind of really pretty much flat. Again, this in terms of magnitudes, which just to be cautious because of the endogenous nature, is 14% association between a 1 standard deviation in the diversity of the birth population and new business startups. We don't really see anything for entrepreneurial quality. When we get to terrain ruggedness, we're going to look at the geographic variation and see that, hey, as we go from a 1 standard deviation increase in terrain ruggedness, we're going to see a 14%. Graphically, you see that here in the bin scatters. We also see that quality seems to be positively affected with terrain ruggedness, the magnitudes being consistent with the diversity, 14% in terrain ruggedness with new business startups, and around 2% over the unconditional mean with respect to entrepreneurial quality. Again, these factors are all related with each other. When we put them in a horse race in one regression, which again isn't completely kosher, but we kind of see that the effects of all three remain significant in similar magnitude. And that holds across however you want to partition the sample, post 2000 registrations or post 2005 registration. So these effects seem to be, these associations seem to be persistent throughout the sample. When we start thinking about, interactive effects between our factors, kind of what we end up seeing is that with respect to total frontier experience and terrain ruggedness, where diversity, where historical diversity is present, we kind of see an amplification in these areas of the association between new business formation. And finally, when we kind of think about how does this historical diversity affect today's underrepresented minorities, thinking about, well, if you had a simulation or you had diversity in the historical past, is it easier to foster new things in the current versus areas that are more homogeneous and haven't been kind of exposed to this diversity? Would these areas be the ones where we see kind of more of the growing pains? And consistent with Fien that there is a benefit from historical diversity, we see that in these areas where you have higher historical diversity, you get greater local entrepreneurial activity in the present day relative to areas that have the similar minority representation today, but didn't have that historical diversity, right? And that's kind of thinking about, how do you assimilate? And maybe there is some dynamics in a simulation, right? It's not just like you force people to interact today and that's going to get you the benefit. It might require time, and that might be consistent with what we're kind of documenting here. So wrapping up, we examine the role of geographic and historical cultural factors in shaping new business formation. We document, just as like an empirical fact, that time invariant county characteristics explain roughly 75% of the variation in new businesses. Then we look at time invariant historical, cultural, and geographic factors. These seem to be associated with developments of individualism, as well as in the prevalence of entrepreneurial entry in the local area. Hopefully showing there is kind of a fundamental role to think about the frontier culture in shaping how startups occur in the US and in helping explain entrepreneurial activity in the US. And again, this is just something that we think to spur more research at the role of cultural drivers and new business formation across not just small business, but also tech and high innovation driven businesses as well. And thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, John. Our discussant is Sam Bazzi. Can you stop?
Yeah.
Let's see. Great.
Wait a minute. How do I stop sharing?
All right. Great. So thanks very much for the opportunity to discuss this paper. It was a really fun paper to read. And I should say, I'd say the last like 6 or 7 months, I've had a couple of people email me on occasion saying, oh, have you looked at, entrepreneurship? It seems like this would be a really interesting thing to look at. And I said, no, but recently I became aware of this paper. And so I was really happy to see John and Coauthors take this on, because it's obviously like in some ways an obvious paper to write, and one that I think can make a really important contribution to this long-standing sort of almost folk wisdom that links individualism to entrepreneurship, and that people have tried to sort of study in various ways using the Hofstede data in a cross-country context. So there's been efforts to kind of bite off pieces of this this hypothesis, but I think what's neat here is the attempt to use a very particular measure of a proxy for individualism, but one that I think we have a lot of clarity on sort of what it's capturing, and also one that's like deeply connected to the American history and sort of the history of the economic vitality of this country in some ways. And so I think there's really sort of a lot to like about what they're after in this paper. And so what I'm going to do today, putting that praise aside, is try and make sort of 3 sets of comments. The first are going to be, somewhat mundane sort of specification issues, but ones that I think will be important in kind of streamlining the empirical facts from the regressions that they're running. The second will have to do with thinking a bit more about this sort of second component of rugged individualism, i.e. the rugged part, this sort of anti-statist culture, this opposition to big government, and see what more we could potentially learn about that. And then finally, I'll make some remarks and sort of raise some questions about how to push a bit harder on the economic interpretation and see, what other potential measures we could sort of put on the table and try and close the circle in telling the story about individualism and firms. Okay, so some of the mundane stuff. Ruggedness is an important input to the settlement process, and the ease with which a given location is able to be settled quickly by individualists, non-individualists, and it's one of the controls that we use in a robustness check in the appendix. It wasn't sort of one of our core controls. In hindsight, it perhaps should have been. It doesn't seem to matter much for a lot of our outcomes. But I think the one thing sort of that kind of nagged at me as I was reading the paper was why sort of focus solely on ruggedness. when there are so many other geographic factors that could potentially also shape entrepreneurship in interesting and substantive ways, and not simply as sort of a, as an omitted variable that, that one would sort of worry about and gripe about. And so I think one thing to do would potentially be to look at the really broad set of geographic factors and see quantitatively how important are each of them relative to the appropriately sort of residualized TFE. And then, if ruggedness is really popping out, then I'd say, continue sort of focusing on that and try and make sense of that. But if not, I mean, maybe some of these other factors could be quite important as well. And so thinking a bit more broadly about geography and its input to this process as distinct from its contribution to sort of the settlement history of a given location. And then so just very concretely, I would suggest sort of taking the baseline controls that we have in our paper, adding ruggedness, and avoiding sort of in some of the core specifications, the so-called bad controls. So things like income, Republican vote, property tax. And, as John mentioned briefly, like these are, I think some of these are mechanisms. And so, I think we'd want to sort of think about how to account for those, not as sort of controls on the right-hand side, but as potential intermediate outcomes on the left-hand side. And then finally, in sort of the just again, kind of mundane specification points, I think I would think rethink the sort of use of these interactive specifications, interacting diversity, and interacting diversity, ruggedness, and TFE, because I find them a little bit difficult to interpret because ruggedness is shaping TFE, and then both TFE and ruggedness are themselves shaping diversity. And so there's just sort of a lot of arrows going in many directions. And I think when that's the case, I find it difficult to sort of make sense of these types of interactive specifications. And then, just finally on the specification side, there are two sort of leading confounds that I would encourage the authors to think carefully about and see what more one could do. One is this sort of agriculture versus non-agriculture distinction. And of course, in an agricultural context, where everyone's a sort of small farmer, I think at least historically, we would think of those as self-reliant, self-employed entrepreneurs in some sense running their own family farms. But that's a bit distinct from the type of entrepreneurship that I think, we're picking up in the modern data that they're using here. And so I'd try and, make sense of that distinction, perhaps using the predetermined agricultural yield index to do some sample splitting or other attempts. And then, John mentioned doing thinking hard about sort of how to parse out the distinct role of population density today. And I think maybe it would be great to see some of the sort of robustness checks that we propose for kind of parsing out the density, the role of density in contributing to culture, and of course the outcome of interest here being entrepreneurship. And then the second sort of comment that I want to make relates to I titled this slide "Ruggedness as Anti-Statism Rather Than Geography," because when we think about rugged individualism, it's really this combination of individualism as sort of defined in the literature with this sort of anti-statist opposition to big government and government regulation. And this paper, the paper as written, really emphasizes the sort of individual level determinants of entrepreneurship. But I think we want to think a bit about how policy is mattering as well. And the paper does touch on, controls for things like property taxes and so on. But I wonder whether there might be other outcomes that are, policy relevant outcomes, thinking about sort of starting a new business and some of the barriers to doing so at the county level. I'm sort of an outsider to this literature and the entrepreneurship literature, so I don't really know what's out there. But knowing sort of the doing business indicators, despite all of their flaws, I wonder if there's some sort of subnational analog to what you see in those data. And then, some other ideas, maybe unionization rates are important here, in thinking about labor costs for setting up a new business. You can see, I think, union participation rates in some of the popular survey data sets that are used by social scientists. So, you might want to look there. And then, as I mentioned, thinking about Republican voting and property taxes as potential mechanisms, rather than sort of confounding controls that we want to include on the right-hand side. And with all of this, this is perhaps a bit idiosyncratic tastes, but I would try to avoid, I've seen this a lot, perhaps in the last year, thinking about COVID and everyone trying to sort of see whether lockdown policies have mattered, as opposed to sort of individual voluntary behavior. And it's really hard to kind of separate these things out. And so I would probably avoid kind of trying to disentangle individual and policy effects, and stick to sort of the reduced form where we put the policy outcomes on the left-hand side rather than on the right-hand side. Okay, so then the final sort of comments have to do with some other economic mechanisms. And this was touched on briefly, I think, in the talk, a little bit in the paper, but it would be helpful to kind of think a bit more about this distinction between what I've come to understand is subsistence versus more transformational forms of entrepreneurship. And again, I'm an outsider to the entrepreneurship literature, but I do know in the development literature, at least, this sort of distinction is an important one. And in thinking about the places that have sort of longer frontier history in the US, it's possible that some of these forms of entrepreneurship are more about lack of sort of opportunities for gainful employment in someone else's firms, as opposed to something more transformational and innovative. But again, this is the kind of thing that I think would be helpful to kind of clarify, and perhaps the results on the entrepreneurial quality index might speak to this debate a little bit. And then secondly, does the theory have implications for the firm size distribution? I think this came up in one of the comments in the chat as well, but it would be, it'd be neat if you could sort of show us something about the differences in the firm size distribution, or differences in growth of entering firms. I guess this might require some additional data sources, but it's certainly something that I would find particularly interesting. Might there be some time varying effects of TFE on entrepreneurial entry that could generate some additional insights? So thinking a bit about some of the big economic shocks of the last 20 years, or the span of your data. Did counties that were hit harder by the China shock, were people in those places more able to, in high TFE places, more able to kind of seamlessly shift into entrepreneurship, now that the sort of factory jobs in their communities have been decimated? Is there a risk preferences channel? John mentioned the risk aversion in the talk. There's, I guess, some work on this in the finance literature. It'd be nice if you could sort of show something empirically here related to risk tolerance or risk preferences. I'm not sure what sort of county level data might be available at scale, but I know Ben Enke and others have been running some large scale surveys that they've used for sort of county level analysis. And so it's possible that there's some questions about risk or other related things. Some other comments for John. I've shared the slides already, so I'll just sort of skip that and leave more time for Q&A. But just to wrap up, I think this is a really nice paper. It was waiting to be written, and so I've already sort of told a lot of people about it. And I think there's a lot of reasons to be sort of excited about its potential. And I think, having dealt with a lot of skeptics on our initial work on the frontier, I think it does require sort of a lot of tire kicking and sort of robustness checks to kind of rule out all the other possible interpretations of the correlations you're showing. But I think here there really are some clear and compelling takeaways that are possible in pretty short order with some of these some of these suggestions that have come up today. And I think digging deeper on some of these mechanisms could be especially informative, and perhaps take the paper to the next level that I certainly see its potential for. So let me leave it there. Thanks a lot, and I'd encourage you all to read the paper if you haven't already.
Great. Thanks so much, Sam. John, I'll give you a chance, you and a co-author, to respond, and then we'll open up the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Sam, for all the great suggestions and like the inspiration for the paper, because it was reading your paper that kind of got the tires kicking on thinking about this, where we said, well, that's an obvious question to ask about how the individualism and entrepreneurial activity. All the points are well taken. Yes, on the the bad controls, that's something that we kind of tackled with, of thinking, do we want to control for them, even though that's not, given that you've kind of shown that is a mechanism of how total frontier experience works. The anti-statism, yes, that's something we can kind of tease out. The stuff on the distribution and size, yeah, that's one limitation of the data with the registration, that it's kind of like an intent to start up. We're working on kind of linking stuff up, but it would require the other data set, something with establishments that isn't as clear-cut entrepreneurial activity, but might tell us something about the size of these activities. Yeah, you kind of have in mind with individualism as well as anti-statism, that this should be like more neoclassical competition, small firms, not like having eventually just one big startup that takes over the area. So that's something that we can kind of play around with a different data set to kind of tease into that. And the risk preference, yeah, that's kind of how we think about, especially small business entrepreneurship here, is that they're bearing risks. So individualism should be affecting based on some risk preference, that these people have less risk aversion. And yeah, the extent is looking for at the county level, coming up with proxies that, you can do some with some of the surveys. The problem is that you might get into counties where you only have 2 respondents. But that's something that we are working on to kind of tease out. So I think I like all the points, and they're well taken.
Great. So the chat, I think Avery had a few questions. I don't know. Do you want to ask them? Do you feel like they were answered already?
So I think, thank you. First of all, great paper, a new way to think about entrepreneurship. So I commend the authors. I think some of them were answered, but let me just reiterate 1 or 2 points. I think this point about culture, and I think the author said they're working on it, bring it more to the present. The question is, why choose an arbitrary point in the past, where I think it would be really interesting to see how these things play out as counties evolve in terms of immigration. And that would be probably a contribution to the paper. And along the same lines, I think, so maybe I didn't understand it correctly, but the issue that the discussant raised as well of small businesses. So I thought that the quality index would give you some insight into the issue of whether it's a really small business, which would require individualism, or it's a business that's growing. And then there is teamwork and leadership and all these issues that may not be so related. So, and I looked at your results, there's some differential results. So I think you might be able to say something about that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great comment. Yeah, so the EQI is like a probability, right? In terms of an exit, a high growth exit. So we were trying to also be cautious. We didn't want to say, aha, here's like quality increase, because we're regressing a probability index on these linear panel models that, anything could go, right? So we're trying to tease out more. I like the notion of right. Cooperative entrepreneurship that requires team building versus I set up a laundromat, it's just me and I hire workers to clean stuff, right? And the way we can kind of tease that out, we'll think about more. And secondly, on the time series, yeah, we are working, especially on the immigration. Well, the frontier, we know the time period, right? That was when the frontier. So that's kind of right. Where I think we can safely say. But on the immigration stuff, there are different waves. To Sam's point, There's different IV strategies, not just using weather shock in the 1850s, but thinking about the Sequoia, like thinking about railroad connection, because that facilitated and doing kind of the interaction between the shock and the railroad exposure. You could think of the new stuff that Tarak Hassan has on like a gravity approach, looking at push and pull factors, and try to see, is there something different in new migrant waves that are more recent, right, in the 1940s and 50s, and use that to kind of tease out how that relates with the historical as well as with new business development, right? So then we can kind of tease some of the dynamics that way, and the China shock, to the extent that we could credibly kind of quantify the exposure of a county to the China shock, maybe by exposure to factories that were directly in competition with China. We could do something that way to see on how the time series and the dynamics between culture and the new business formation.
Great. Any other questions before we wrap up? Okay. Well, thanks to the presenter, the discussant, and everyone who attended. This has been a great term, ending on a great note. So we'll see everybody in the fall. Keep an eye out for an email for a call for papers for the fall, and some other announcements. So have a great summer.
Thanks, Michael, and the organizers for doing this, for initiating it and keeping it up, and looking forward to next year. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for coming.